Sometimes there's a story about one person whose vision for a perfect world goes so wrong, it drags an entire country into an absolute nightmare. That's exactly what happened in Cambodia. This is the story of how a utopian dream turned into a killing field, all because of the man who called himself Pol Pot. Just let that sink in for a moment. This single sentence was the mantra of the Khmer Rouge. It's not just a political slogan. It's a terrifying calculation that literally erases the value of a human being. And it's the twisted logic that opened the door to one of the most horrifying genocides we've ever seen. And the final tally was just staggering. We're talking about an estimated 2 million people. And let's be clear, this wasn't some tragic byproduct of a civil war. No, this was a government systematically murdering its own citizens. To really wrap your head around that number, it was nearly 25% of Cambodia's population at the time. 1 out of every 4 people. I mean, just try to imagine that. A quarter of your country's entire population just wiped out. The scale is almost impossible to grasp. And what's truly terrifying is how fast it all happened. This wasn't some slow-burning tragedy that unfolded over decades. This was a brutal, violent, lightning-fast re-engineering of an entire country in just 4 years, between 1975 and 1979. So how do we even begin to process this? How does an entire nation get to a point where it starts to destroy itself from the inside out? It really forces you to ask a very, very dark question. To get anywhere near an answer, you have to look beyond the shocking numbers and zero in on the man who orchestrated it all. A man who, believe it or not, didn't start out as a monster. He started out as a privileged son of a well-to-do family. Yeah, the journey from Saloth Sar, his birth name, to the infamous Pol Pot is a wild story of radicalization. And it's a story that doesn't begin in the jungles of Cambodia, but in the cafes of Paris, of all places. So get this, he was born into a pretty wealthy landowning family. His early life was comfortable, He got an education in Buddhist monasteries and then French colonial schools. But the real fork in the road came when he went to Paris on a scholarship to study radio electronics. It was there he got sucked into these radical communist groups and totally embraced a very extreme version of the ideology. Meanwhile, back home, Cambodia was in chaos because of the Vietnam War next door. It was the perfect storm for his radical ideas to grow. And by 1975, the educated, privileged Saloth Sar was completely gone, replaced by the revolutionary leader they called Brother Number One, Pol Pot. This really just lays bare the massive contradiction at the very core of this man. The son of the elite who became the sworn enemy of all elites. The student who benefited from modern society, who then decided his life's mission was to violently destroy it. It's a complete 180. So what was this grand vision that demanded such a violent change? Well, it was this fanatical, completely warped dream of creating a perfect, pure society, an agricultural utopia built from the ground up. The whole thing was built around this concept he called Year Zero. And this wasn't about reform. This was about hitting the giant reset button on civilization itself. He was inspired by Mao's Cultural Revolution, but decided to take it to a much, much more terrifying level. The goal was to literally annihilate the past. Any history, any culture, any knowledge that existed before the Khmer Rouge, it was all declared corrupt and had to be destroyed. And to pull off Year Zero, you had to tear down society as we know it. Cities, they were seen as centers of evil, so they were emptied out. Money and private property, they create inequality, so they were gone. Religion, even the family unit, those were competing loyalties to the state, so they were outlawed. And modern ideas, Western influence, that was a poison. And the only way to get rid of it was to eliminate the very people who held those ideas, the educated class. So you have this abstract, fanatical idea. The next step is turning it into a real-world plan. And they did. It was a methodical process, a genocide that was engineered with a cold, terrifying efficiency. It was like a 4-step playbook from hell. First, they force-marched millions of people out of the cities, literally turning them into ghost towns overnight. Then, they created this bizarre new class system. Rural peasants were the base people, the good guys. But if you were from a city, you were a new person, and you were automatically an enemy. Everyone was then forced onto these massive collective farms, basically working as slaves until they died from starvation or exhaustion. And then finally, the purges began. And here's the truly insane part. The definition of an enemy was so vague, it could be anyone. If you wore glasses, that suggested you were an intellectual who read books, a death sentence. If you knew a foreign language, that was a sign of corrupting foreign influence, a death sentence. Being a doctor, a teacher, a monk, these weren't respected professions anymore. They were marks for execution. And the epicenter of this paranoid purge was a former high school in the capital, Phnom Penh. It was turned into the infamous Tuol Sleng prison, also known as S21. Over 20,000 people were sent here to be systematically tortured into giving false confessions before being hauled off to the killing fields. And out of those 20,000 people who walked through the gates of S21, only 7 are known to have survived. 7. That number tells you everything you need to know. It wasn't a prison. It was a processing center for murder. You know, a regime built on this much paranoia and violence, it's just not stable. It's destined to eat itself from the inside out. And for Pol Pot, the end came when he turned that same aggression he used on his own people outward. He started ordering these bloody raids across the border into Vietnam. Well, eventually Vietnam had enough and launched a full-scale invasion in late 1978. Just a few weeks later, the Khmer Rouge regime completely collapsed. But Pol Pot himself got away. He escaped into the jungle and led a guerrilla war for almost another 2 decades. And in a really messed up twist of Cold War politics, he actually got support from China and even the US at times because they were against the new Vietnamese-backed government. In the end, he died in 1998, an old man under house arrest by his own former comrades, never once having to face a real court for his crimes. Years later, after the world had seen the horrors of the killing fields, he gave one of his last interviews, and he showed absolutely zero remorse. He actually said his conscience was clear, that he had no responsibility for the deaths of 2 million of his own people. That denial might just be the most chilling part of his entire legacy. The regime itself only lasted 4 years, but its impact is permanent. Pol Pot left Cambodia a completely traumatized nation, a countryside filled with millions of landmines, and a society that had been robbed of its brightest and most creative people. You can still see those scars today. So, when you look back at all this, what are the main takeaways? His horrific legacy really boils down to 5 key things. First, the genocide itself, the mind-boggling scale and speed of the killing. Second, the insane Year Zero experiment that was the engine for it all. Third, the targeted destruction of an entire country's intellectual and cultural soul. Fourth, the fact that he got away with it. He died without ever facing justice, which is just a gut punch to the survivors. And finally, the trauma that lasts to this day, a nation still healing from its wounds. And that brings us right back to where we started, with a question that just seems to haunt us throughout history. Pol Pot's story is an extreme example, but it's a powerful warning. It shows us how the search for a perfect world, when it's fueled by absolute, uncompromising ideology, can end up creating a perfect hell. And that's a question that is still, tragically, very relevant today.